Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to Hilaal Live. My name is Faraz, but I would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. I also like to thank my colleague Lukman Shadrack for taking us through for that first 1 hour. Now, of course, the big story of today, the Correctional Services Department has said that former President Jacob Zuma will not be required to complete his prison sentence. This is despite the Constitutional Court dismissing Zuma's application last month for leave to appeal a Supreme Court of Appeal ruling that he must return to prison to finish his 15-month sentence. Joining us now to discuss this is political analyst and ASRI Director of Research, Angelo Fick. Angelo, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Good evening to you and to your viewers.
Angelo, let's start off, of course, this from a political point of view, because when listening to Justice Minister Ronald Lamola this morning, it seemed as if it was more on the line of caution than it was the line of following the law. Can caution really be something that can be attributed to Jacob Zuma, of course, not completing his prison sentence?
So I think here the African National Congress government really maneuvered itself into a corner, and so it got hoisted by its own petard. In dealing with Jacob Zuma over the last decade and a half, it has really always chosen to support him because they've conflated him with the party. And what we've seen in this moment is a repetition of this idea that Jacob Zuma is different from everybody else, and an attempt to cover that assumption of difference by suggesting that his release or remission was going to be part of a package of thousands of people getting the same deal. This is ironic given that the country is in the middle of a complicated relationship with battling criminality, under-resourced policing, underpaid police people, a correctional services, the prison system that's been in disrepute because of the spectacular escapes of very prominent prisoners, and that trial is ongoing. And so it is curious to see that a year ahead of an election, the African National Congress is once again, by its own maneuverings, asked to make a choice of how much they want the electorate to put up with. And from a political point of view, one has to say that, yes, there may have been all sorts of questions around security to avoid the repetition of the July 2021 issues. But again, that should be something that the African National Congress government has to take some responsibility for, because they, after all, have been in power for 29 years, and they've built or not built the social cohesion, the security, and the state apparatuses through which, or lacking which, we sit with this situation.
Angelo, the easiest thing for the ANC to say, or for government to say, is that, well, we don't want a repeat of July 2021, because if we put the former president back, a certain section of his supporters are going to go ahead and continue that. Is that a fair statement if they are to use that as probably one of their reasonings behind not putting him back in prison?
Well, if they were to use that reasoning, and I'm not certain that they would any longer, they would then suggest that we are all being held to ransom by a small group of people who are, threatening us with either political instability or violence. And that would be disastrous given the week that we've just had, particularly the people who live in the Western Cape and in the city of Cape Town, where people who want their own way hold you to a certain kind of ransom. And that's a form of terrorism that I think we cannot indulge in a state that already has the insecurities that South Africa has. So yes, the African National Congress as a party has had difficulty with this, but its deployees in government have made choices that actually deepen the crisis rather than resolve it. And step by step over the last 15 years, they've brought themselves to this juncture where they seem to have no choice but to release a former president from having to serve time in a penitentiary, in a penal facility, precisely because the alternative is considered too horrific, too unsustainable, or too untenable. And if that is going to be the case, organized criminal elements must be looking to this and thinking, well, now we know how we're going to avoid all sorts of crises.
Angelo, the judiciary, there's so many citizens that look at the judiciary even more so today and continue to question it. How much political influence is there within the judiciary? Because you try to separate each arm of the state, but yet it just feels as if everything influences each other, and none more so than what we saw today and what we have been seeing before. Politics and just its influence within the judiciary here in South Africa?
So the judgment was very specific that the decision, whether or not, the requirements have been served, rests with the Director General of Correctional Services and not with the judges. And so the judges were very, very keen and at pains to try and keep the separation of powers doctrine as it is. The executive authority on correctional services is, of course, the minister and all of his officials, and they are often cadres deployed. And so the question that arises here is not whether or not the judiciary can be trusted, but whether or not the separation of powers is observed, and that seems to be the case here. And then secondarily, whether the arms of government, whether it is the executive or the legislature, really takes not just the letter of the law as handed down by the judiciary, but the spirit of the law and the oath of office that they take when they swear allegiance to the Constitution, whether they take that seriously. And here, equality of administration, equality before the law, equality of administrative justice is something that millions of South Africans are going to ask very, very tough questions of the executive arm, precisely because if you got shoplifting for food, you shoplifted food to feed your children during an economic crisis, you may not have the ability to walk in and out of prison within an hour and a half. And this is not a new problem in South Africa, that the inequality in relation to administrative justice is certainly something that the former Chief Justice, Mogoeng, remarked upon. But if you go back all the way to 2010, if you were poor, and didn't have cultural or international embassy power on your side, you went to prison very, very quickly for violating rules around who could trade what outside of a football stadium. But if you were from the first world, Western Europe, or you were wealthy, you didn't even get charged but got whisked out of the situation. So we need to be very, very clear that the Jacob Zuma imprisonment or not imprisonment, his remission through this very quick process, is not just an indication of the failure of the entire system, but is a symptom of the inequality that has long been in the system, where those with political connections are treated very differently from those who don't have them. And many people have brought up the Shabir Sheikh issue, and who goes to prison and who does not. And so a precedent has been set, ironically, around a president. And the African National Congress, I think, and their deployees in government, must be banking on how those who are ambivalent about the support for the party are not going to be alienated from the party ahead of 2024. And the choice for them may not even have been about violence or about insurrection, but it may have been about loyal cadres of the ANC or cadres of the ANC simply not supporting the party in 2024 if the previous president of the party is sitting in prison at the behest of the current administration, headed by the current president of the party, who had a narrow victory in 2017, a slightly more substantial victory in 2022, but is often thought of to not really be favored among all members of the party.
Angelo, heading into next year's elections, I mean, maybe there's a certain section of the ANC supporters who still have an affiliation to former President Zuma that may be smiling from head to toe heading into this weekend. Many other supporters of the ANC who still believe in the justice system would look at this and see a sense of unfavorability with regards to that. And then probably the rest of the citizens of South Africa looking at this and saying, well, the ANC is just spat in the face of the justice system and the judiciary. Has the ANC right now really, again, punched another hole in their armor heading into next year's elections by today's decision?
So technically, the ANC did not make this decision. This decision was made by the executive arm of government, and those people may be deployees of the ANC, and they will have taken legal advice on this. And so one must be very clear that while the ANC itself may not often draw the distinction between party and state, we have to make that distinction. So the executive arm of government, through the Minister of Correctional Justice and Correctional Services, made the decision through the DGs and through the prison officials that they're going to follow through on what the judgment allows them. They may have had security concerns, which they haven't really shared with us in full. And if they have those security concerns, the question is, what are they doing to address those security concerns in addition to this particular step? The African National Congress has welcomed the decision, and I think that that was to be expected. The question arises whether or not in 2024, people will remember this, because the African National Congress went through the 14 elections with the Nkandla scandal already brewing. It went through the 2019 elections with all sorts of other problems. It is already aware that by its own research, it might have to form a coalition in 2024 to retain power in government or find itself in the opposition benches if somebody else is able to form a majority coalition. And so it must be banking on how its internal supporters need not to be alienated, and hence they will welcome this decision. But in the longer term, there will be questions around rule of law. And the same questions arise from what is going on in the Western Cape around the taxi violence. What happens when the players involved cannot be subjected to the rule of law because they behave in ways that are extrajudicial? And what does that mean for ordinary people when they face administrative justice through the court system? Because the Constitution supposedly guarantees equality of appearance before the law, but treatment is often very different, and that can be on the basis of class, on the basis of access to wealth, and, as we have seen over the last 20 years, in relation to access to political networks and favors, or, as we've now seen since July 2021, and more recently in the Western Cape, through your ability to wield violence as a tool to prevent yourself from being subjected to the letter of the law.
Angelo, thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
That's Angelo Fick, political analyst and ASRI director of research. Now, after the break, yesterday I had a conversation with Qari Bashir Patel and Qari Huzaifa Lockhart to talk about the upcoming Quran competition that will be hosted across various provinces within the country. So do stay tuned for that conversation.